Berlyn Schutz breaks a Nebraska track and field record that stood for nearly 20 years at today's Mark Colligan Memorial Meet. The Lincoln East alum runs the 800 meter in 2 minutes and 4.81 seconds, beating the record set by Egle Ulias in 2006 by just under half a second.